This is the live stream for GitLab pods.
All right. Yep. Thanks, Sid. You had the first item.
Yeah, that was someone remarked like, hey, this might be good for bring your own key functionality. And I think Josh, you did an amazing job of writing out like how that would work. So GitLab pods would enable it at the, because then you can split customers across hardware. It would enable doing that at the infrastructure layer, which might be a lot simpler. So I think you did a great job in the write-up.
Cool. Yeah, it's interesting. I think the balance between this and horse or dedicated is will be interesting to think through. But yeah, it's I think because we'll be less efficient on infrastructure since it's dedicated, unless we get really good at scaling on like Kubernetes and things like that.
Cool. Thanks so much.
Yep. Cool. I had the third item. This is from last week. City reviewed it actually yesterday on the dedicated call, but I did update it to try and make it more clear that the goal would be all SaaS environments.
Thanks for that. Let's have a look at the slide. I would go further than just the tooling. I would say we reduce the dedicated backend.
Yep.
Cool. You can update the text to this one on the other slide deck as well. That'd be great.
Yeah, it's slightly different wording because it assumes different levels of knowledge on both, but I'll make this the same changes.
Cool. Thanks.
Yep. I did add a section on iteration strategies from our last call that starts, I think, currently on slide 21.
Cool. That might work. I don't think decomposition is part of the pod strategy. I think actually it's working against us. And it is what it is. It's happening,
Yeah.
but I don't think we should embrace it as like, oh, it's such a good iteration strategy.
Yeah, my thought there is that we're actually sort of splitting off the CI workflow into a separate database now, and we can then like pick up from, so we're adding the code with the CI workflows to use a different database. And then we can continue on from there to then shard just the CI workflows in the CI database. And then we can then basically take that pattern and grab the next, most likely scaling impacted workflow, and then do both at the same time, right? So we're getting some of the code benefits out of multiple databases now, which you likely need anyways for sharding, and then we can just keep going further with the tenant sharding.
I disagree. I think that I think that right now we're being forced to do a lot of work to like account for the decoupled database, and we haven't solved that yet. And there's talk of two-phase commits and all that stuff. That's effort we could have all not have if we just went to pods straight away.
Yeah, I guess the question would be, how do you get there? Well, in this proposal, at least, you try to shard workflow by workflow. So like you might take CI first.
That's extremely hard. And now you have the integration problem between CI and the rest, between package and the rest, between this and the rest. So you're just creating a whole bunch of extra problems that are just unnecessary to get to pods.
Yeah. Huh.
So I have a couple of comments. I think if you would go to a pod-like architecture, my understanding is that you would try to keep the pods small enough so that you wouldn't, at least in the beginning, have to shard the database, because you can control how many customers live in a pod.
Exactly.
If you have a very large customer at some point, then you may need to still shard the database somehow to accommodate, but that.
There's no customer in the world that has more than 500,000 active users. We can run that on the database.
So I think that
let's not make up problems that are there.
And I might be using the wrong terminology here, which might be why this isn't coming across as at least clearly as it was in my mind. Like when I meant shard, I didn't mean to like shard it like within a pod, but basically, we have a database and we can take a workflow and make it like the beginning of a pod, if that makes sense, without having to update every single cross namespace workflow at the same time before you leverage any benefits. So like we could take CI, make it work with pods.
We can already do that with the federation strategy on page 23, and that's much more successful. Like, hey, if you use dedicated, you cannot send merge requests to other projects. 99 of customers are going to be fine with that. They never do that to begin with. So that is our strategy. I think what's going to happen is that on one hand, we're decomposing. On the other hand, we're kind of sharding with pods. And now we're going to have the complexity of both, which is not twice the complexity. It's like exponential complexity. And we slide 24 should be a big warning sign saying, wow, there's something really bad going on. Namely, we also have this other strategy and we don't need both. Like if we do pods, we wouldn't need decomposition. And if
I disagree somewhat. I think the decomposition work is happening right now to address our immediate scaling needs in .com.
No,
and I think that is.
Look, I'm not stopping decomposition. What I'm saying is if we would have started pods 2 years ago, and if it would be ready today, we probably wouldn't have needed decomposition. It's a short-term fix that we're now forced into.
I don't think that is wrong. If we had committed to a pod strategy and said this is an acceptable solution for our customers and we control the workflows that people are allowed to do or not to do, then I think that's correct.
And I want the presentation to reflect that. And I pushed for kind of a pod-like strategy 2 years ago. Wasn't very articulate. That's why we're having this meeting, to make sure that this time the proposal is clear. I'm not stopping decomposition, but I think the slide should reflect it's two alternative things, and kind of decomposition makes pods harder, not easier. And we're going to end up with a code base that implements both patterns, which is going to sell us a more technical debt.
Yeah, I guess I'd like to try just one more time of explaining it, because I'm not sure if it's, I'm not trying, and then we can move on and we can update the slide, but I'm not trying to say that we continue decomposition like forward and bring that model forward, but we would basically pick up where we leave off in January decomposition, and then, you know, take decomposition and just adapt it to be the first workflow that works on a pod architecture.
Yeah, I can see that we split up CI into pods first. I can also see us take all the rest and split that up into pods first. Either works. I've not made a determination which it is, but what we should be very clear about is that it's working against us, not with us, and it's going to cause exponential.
Well, I think one thing that I would like to highlight is that I, at least, for example, I read a little bit in the Vitesse documentation right now, and this pattern of isolating a workflow and then sharding that once you've isolated that, I think is something that happens in there, but the architecture is very different because it's not pod-like. It talks about sort of sharding your database and then handling other components individually. If I understand pods correctly, it essentially takes the entire stack.
Exactly.
Ship it.
There's two separate patterns. You can do either is valid as a scaling strategy. The problem is we also need pods as a data locality strategy. So we get a free scaling strategy, but instead of using that, we're also implementing another pattern, which is going to cause us to do both. And that's going to cause a lot of complexity in the code base and everything else. We now have to go to self-managed customers. Yeah, you need multiple database schemas and stuff like that, even though you only have 100 users. It's going to be, oh yeah, you have two phases commits between all your stuff and the CI stuff. Like it's all additional, and that needs to be super, super clear. And look, I'm not stopping decomposition. It seems a short-term fix we need, but I'd love to undo it sooner rather than later due to pods. But we'll see how fast we can do pods, because pods is way harder than decomposition. So
yeah, and I think this is I think that's an important point, at least for me. My understanding is that arriving at a point where we have sort of a pod-like system up and running that we can manage and deploy is not straightforward. And so I think that is, but I think it is true that if you do pods, and this is the ultimate goal, then that is a very different architecture to taking, for example, Vitesse and scaling your database, and then separately scaling Redis or your whatever you need to scale, and they address different. They address this differently. And in my mind, one of the difficulties with pods is the lack of support for cross-pod workflows. If you have to do this, then and you have to do it for many different.
You need to build it, just like you need to build cross-function workflows in a decomposition thing. think this should be an entire section outside of integration with the relationship between the two, because my intuition is that we're going down we're doing the right short-term thing, but the wrong long-term thing.
I think that's probably true. So I'll make it clear in slide 23 that we would be in this proposal. I'll add the section on how they're different, and in particular the notes that you have here for sure. And then on slide 23, I'll make it very clear that while we could be picking up from the current state of decomposition, we would not be caring for decomposition as in the by function, decomposing by function, is that we would actually be shifting towards pods just by using CI as the first workflow that aligns to the pod architecture, if that makes sense.
I think maybe one sort of counter point to this is, if we were to not do pods, but we would go towards sort of sharding our database with Vitess or doing this in other ways, I think decomposition would actually help us. So I think the question, that there is more than one proposal on how to go, sort of what happens after decomposition. And I think that is, I think that's maybe important to keep in mind.
I'm not sure. So Vitess can be used to implement pods. I don't know. You then also need decomposition. I don't think so. But let's have we're running out of time. So let's have that conversation when we've made these slides. And I'll add it as an explicit point. So this every point can be like almost a slide or something like that, because this is the crux that I've been trying to get across for many, many times, and I'm so far failing. So apparently needs more slides.
I think I'm aligned with you on this. I think I just did a poor job of explaining my proposal in slide 23. So I'll go through and do both. I think we can skip number 4 in the interest of time. It's a minor update. On 5, I think it might be worthwhile to align on some goals of pods, or really the overall effort in general, so that we have some North Stars to work towards. So I wrote down some brief ones there. I'll work on a slide. I just think it'd be worthwhile as we evaluate pods and then potentially the tests, around what we're trying to achieve and preserve or not preserve.
I'm totally missing the data locality. That is the thing that pods give you that customers want. Like, I want my data to stay in the European Union. I want my data to stay in Great Britain. That is going to be a requirement for future SaaS services. That's why pods is the superior solution to decomposition.
That's a good one. So I'll get these written up and we can continue to refine and iterate.
And then the D one, continue to about the cross namespace workflow, I would say. Cross. We can live without that for 99% of our customers.
So this is maybe related to 7. I'm trying to actually get some data to support that statement, as in how many customers actually have more than one namespace, and do they contribute across those? And my suspicion is similar to yours, that is very rare. But I think that is something that we may be able to get out of what we have right now and support that.
Yep, they might have multiple namespaces, but we can just put all of those on a pod. It's about,
that's right, but Yeah,
but
I also really
open
question
doors and things like that.
Yeah, but I also I don't know. I would like to see some data on it, but I suspect that a customer who signs up to SaaS, gets their own namespace, they may only very rarely reference things outside their namespace.
That's
Yep. I think I agree. I think we're all. I think it's unlikely. I think the one question for me is strategically, how important is this for us to preserve a potential model for open source on GitLab.com?
I think it's important, but I think we should acknowledge that we can start with pods without this, and then we can add it later, and then it can be slightly less convenient. Like we're willing to compromise here.
Yeah.
And then the compromise, look, most of the time you can solve that later.
Cool. For the interest of time, I have number 6. I added a couple of slides to describe how Vitess handles regions. Still a little bit drafty, but I think in essence, this seems to be supported via Vitess. You can have more than one Vitess cluster, and you can then essentially shard your data based on locality. What Vitess is seemingly not able to handle is sort of geographically distributed writes.
Nobody needs those.
Nobody needs that. But yeah, this I just Googled around a little bit, and seemingly for Slack, Vitess enabled sort of the data and regional requirements for their backend. So that is something that does work. But there's a lot of jargon in the Vitess documentation in terms of how they do this, and I'll do a little bit more work to understand how it works in detail. I'm not saying this is a requirement. I'm just highlighting this as a limitation that Vitess has itself.
Sure, but for regions, what is regions?
So regions for me is you have your data within a.
But this is like a Vitess document. This is a GitLab document. What are you?
No, this is a Vitess document, but regions is the concept as to how we refer to this functionality. Okay. So this is a direct quote from the Vitess documentation from there.
Cool. It's good to detail that it doesn't do it, but we don't need this.
Yep. I think it's an interesting point that Vitess is being used to distribute data into specific data localities as well. But then you still have to handle all of the other components on top of it if people are very sensitive to that. So Redis and all of that. And if I understand, again, pods correctly, you get that as a sort of package.
Well, let's look at the databases are problem. So if you can split up the database in pods, we'd already be better. Like the first,
yes.
We have an end vision with pods, and maybe this should be in the iteration part. But the first thing, if we can just split the database up into two things, all the people who never have a cross namespace workflow and all the rest of the people, and both are like equally active, we buy ourselves the 10x headroom that decomposition also buys us. So let's look at that as the first iteration, and we don't need to do anything else. So that's the first iteration of pods. It's just like, hey, can we get the same thing that we get from CI decomposition? So I'm really looking forward to, Fabian, the work that you talked about. Let's look at how many people need a cross namespace workflow, because if that's like 50% of our activity or more,
yes,
we got a great initial thing, and we should now we're in the race to do that instead of decomposition. But we should We don't want to rattle the decomposition work until we have such a data point and we know we can do it. And then we still have like Vitesse doesn't support Postgres problem.
Yes, that is a big issue.
Yep.
And I didn't follow your statement on how this relates to decomposition. Maybe you can explain it again.
So with decomposition, we add a ton of technical complexity to the product that we don't need if pods was ready today. So with pods ready, today, it's not about having it work for Elasticsearch and Redis and everything else. No, we got a one problem, which is like our database has too many transactions or too many writes. So our database has too many writes. So if we could split our database into two pods, one of the it's like you can have all your cross namespace stuff because it's in the same database. The other one is like they never touch all the other people's namespaces, where we buy ourselves as much headroom as we do with decomposition. We prevent going down a path that we later revert because we don't need both.
Okay.
Types of technical.
Yes, I get it. And so I think this is for me a really interesting question. It's like if most customers don't need cross namespace queries, then we don't need to solve that problem for them. And that saves us a lot of complexity. And that is actually the cheapest way of solving it because we don't need to do anything.
Exactly. And you might find that 80% of our writes don't need cross namespace workflow. If that's the case, then decomposition buys us 2x scaling, and this would buy us 5x scaling. And I strongly suspect that that's the case. And we can say, hey, look, pods is a bit more painful, but it's 5x scaling instead of 2x. So do that instead of immediately after the CI decomposition. Don't decompose another function, but go for the 5x.
No, that makes sense to me. I think that that's similar to how I think about it on some level.
Great.
Yep, agreed. The cross namespace workflow is the crux of this whole problem. So the better we understand those, the more informed we'll be.
Instead of trying to solve the cross namespace workflow, we're just like, how long can we delay that problem?
Yeah.
Cool. Anything else? Otherwise, I think that's all we had for today.
This is great. And Christina, can you send this YouTube to the CEO channel? I want to mention a few people. This recording. Cool. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And